On the morning of November 18, 1943, deep within the Kure Naval Arsenal's metallurgical laboratory in southern Japan, Dr. Takeshi Yamamoto placed a fragment of metal under his microscope with hands that trembled slightly. The steel specimen before him had been recovered 3 weeks earlier from a downed American aircraft in the Solomon Islands, transported across thousands of kilometers of ocean with the same reverence one might afford a religious artifact. He believed, as did his colleagues and the military leadership that depended on their expertise, that Japanese metallurgical science stood among the finest in the world, that their steel production methods represented the pinnacle of Eastern industrial achievement. Within the next 72 hours, that certainty would shatter as completely as the crystalline structure he was about to examine. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Dr. Yamamoto and his team of 6 senior metallurgists were about to discover would not only transform their understanding of industrial capability, but would expose a gap in production technology so vast that it would fundamentally alter Japan's strategic calculations for the remainder of the conflict. The revelation waiting in that microscope would prove that sometimes the most devastating weapon is not carried onto the battlefield, but forged in the foundries thousands of kilometers away. Dr. Yamamoto had spent 17 years studying metallurgy, first at Tokyo Imperial University, and later during a 3-year fellowship in Germany during the mid-1930s. At 41 years old, he directed the most advanced materials analysis laboratory in the Japanese Empire, a facility that employed 32 specialists and occupied an entire wing of the sprawling Kure Arsenal complex. The laboratory's mission was straightforward yet critical. Analyze enemy materials, identify weaknesses, and develop countermeasures that would give Japanese forces every possible advantage. The steel fragment measured approximately 8 centimeters by 12 centimeters, jagged-edged and scorched black along one side from the aircraft fire that had brought down its carrier. It had come from the fuselage of a B-17 bomber, one of the massive 4-engine aircraft that American forces were beginning to deploy with increasing frequency across the Pacific theater. Initial visual inspection had revealed nothing remarkable. The surface showed typical oxidation patterns, standard riveting holes, and manufacturing marks consistent with mass production techniques. But weight told a different story. When Yamamoto's assistant, a young engineer named Kenji Sato, had first weighed the fragment, he rechecked his measurements 3 times before reporting the results. The steel was lighter than expected, not dramatically so, but enough to register as anomalous. Lighter steel typically meant weaker steel, a trade-off that Japanese metallurgists understood well from their own production challenges. Yet intelligence reports consistently described American aircraft absorbing damage that would have torn Japanese planes apart, returning to base with dozens of holes punched through their structures. The contradiction gnawed at Yamamoto. How could lighter steel be stronger? It violated fundamental principles of materials science as he understood them. He adjusted the microscope's focus, bringing the steel's crystalline structure into sharp relief. What he saw made him pause, lean back, and clean the lens carefully before looking again. The grain structure was extraordinarily fine, far more uniform than anything he had seen in Japanese steel samples. The crystals aligned in patterns that suggested a tempering process of remarkable precision, each grain interlocking with its neighbors in a way that would distribute stress evenly across the entire structure. Then Sato said, his voice carrying an edge of uncertainty that Yamamoto had never heard from the normally confident young engineer. "Doctor, the spectrographic analysis is complete. You need to see these results." Yamamoto crossed to the spectrograph station, where Sato stood beside a machine that cost more than most Japanese families would earn in a lifetime. The device could identify the precise elemental composition of any metal sample, breaking down its constituent parts to within a fraction of 1% accuracy. Sato handed him the analysis sheet, and Yamamoto felt his professional certainty begin to crack. The steel contained molybdenum, nickel, and chromium in proportions that Japanese foundries could only dream of maintaining consistently. But more than that, the carbon content was controlled to a degree that seemed almost impossible. Japanese steel production facilities struggled with carbon variation of plus or minus 0.3% across a single batch. This American steel showed variation of less than 0.05%. That level of consistency required industrial processes operating at a scale and precision that Yamamoto had never imagined possible. Over the next 2 days, Yamamoto's team subjected the fragment to every test in their arsenal. They measured tensile strength, finding that the steel could withstand forces of over 90,000 pounds per square inch before failing, nearly 3 times the strength of comparable Japanese aviation steel. They tested ductility, discovering that the material could bend far further before fracturing than anything produced in Japanese mills. They analyzed the tempering, revealing a heat treatment process so precisely controlled that it suggested furnaces capable of maintaining temperatures within a range of plus or minus 5 degrees across hours of continuous operation. Each test result arrived like a hammer blow to assumptions built over decades of study and practice. On the evening of the second day, Yamamoto sat in his office reviewing the compiled data as winter rain drummed against the windows. His desk was covered with graphs, photographic plates from the microscope, and pages dense with calculations. Across from him sat 3 of his senior colleagues, Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, who specialized in alloy chemistry, engineer Masaru Kobayashi, an expert in industrial production processes, and Dr. Yuki Nakamura, the laboratory's leading authority on stress analysis. Tanaka spoke first, his words measured and careful. The alloy composition alone suggests access to raw materials we simply cannot match. The molybdenum content is particularly significant. Our domestic sources provide perhaps 1/10 the quantity needed to produce steel of this quality in meaningful volumes. Kobayashi nodded, adding his own analysis. But the composition is only part of the equation. The uniformity of the crystal structure indicates production facilities operating with quality control measures we have never achieved. To maintain this consistency, they must be producing this steel in electric arc furnaces, probably dozens of them, operating continuously. Yamamoto looked at Nakamura, who had remained silent throughout the discussion. The stress analysis expert had spent the entire day running mathematical models, calculating exactly what these test results meant in practical terms for aircraft construction and combat performance. Nakamura finally spoke, and his voice was hollow. "Gentlemen, if American industry can produce this quality of steel in sufficient quantities to build hundreds of bombers, then our assumptions about industrial parity are not merely optimistic, they are fantasy. A Japanese fighter aircraft, constructed from our standard steel alloys, would need to strike an American bomber constructed from this material with approximately 3 times the force to inflict equivalent structural damage. But the American bomber, firing weapons constructed from similar steel, would need only 1/3 the force to damage our aircraft." The implications hung in the air like the smoke from Yamamoto's cigarette. They were not discussing abstract metallurgical theory. They were calculating the mathematics of survival, and the equation was devastatingly one-sided. Then Yamamoto said, his voice quiet but firm, "We need to understand the full scope of this. One sample tells us about capability. We need to know about capacity. How much of this steel are they producing? How widely is it deployed? Is this exceptional or is this standard?" Over the following 3 weeks, Yamamoto's laboratory became a collection point for American steel samples gathered from across the Pacific Theater. Fragments arrived from Guadalcanal, from New Guinea, from the Aleutians. They came from aircraft, from ships, from vehicles, from weapons. Each piece was catalogued, tested, and analyzed with the same rigorous methodology applied to the first fragment. The results were consistent to a degree that Yamamoto found almost incomprehensible. Whether the steel came from a bomber downed over Rabaul or a tank tread recovered in the jungles of New Guinea, the quality remained remarkably uniform. This was not special steel reserved for critical applications. This was standard production material, the baseline from which American industry operated. In early December of 1943, Yamamoto received an unusual visitor, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome. A senior officer in the Naval General Staff arrived at the laboratory unannounced, accompanied by 2 aides and carrying authorization from the highest levels of military command. The admiral wanted answers, and he wanted them delivered in terms that strategic planners could incorporate into their calculations. Yamamoto had prepared a comprehensive briefing, complete with photographic evidence, test results, and comparative analyses. He had rehearsed his presentation, anticipating questions, and preparing responses that would be both accurate and palatable to military leadership, already struggling with increasingly difficult strategic realities. The briefing took place in the laboratory's main conference room, a austere space dominated by a large table and walls lined with technical diagrams. Yamamoto stood at the head of the table, his presentation materials arranged in careful order. The admiral sat flanked by his aides, their faces composed in expressions of professional neutrality that barely concealed their anxiety about what they were about to hear. Yamamoto began with the basics, explaining the testing methodology and the properties being measured. He showed the admiral samples of Japanese steel and American steel side by side, pointing out the visible differences in grain structure through microscope photographs projected onto the wall. Then he delivered the core findings, speaking in the clear, direct language that the admiral had requested. Based on our analysis of 47 separate samples collected from 14 different locations across the Pacific Theater, we have determined that American steel production operates at a level of quality and consistency that exceeds our capabilities by a factor of approximately 2 to 3 times across all critical measures. Tensile strength, ductility, uniformity of composition, and precision of heat treatment all demonstrate superior industrial processes. The admiral leaned forward slightly. Can we duplicate these processes? Can we improve our production to match these standards? Yamamoto had known this question would come. He had spent days formulating his response, consulting with colleagues, reviewing Japan's industrial infrastructure and resource availability. The answer was not one he wanted to deliver. Admiral, duplication would require fundamental restructuring of our entire steel production industry. We would need access to raw materials, particularly molybdenum, nickel, and chromium, in quantities that exceed our current supply by factors of 10 or more. We would need to construct new electric arc furnaces with precision temperature control systems that we currently lack the technology to manufacture. We would need to train thousands of workers in quality control procedures that American industry has refined over decades. And even if we could address all these challenges, the time required would be measured in years, not months. The room fell silent. One of the admiral's aides, a younger officer with the bearing of someone educated in engineering, asked a question that Yamamoto had been dreading. "Dr. Yamamoto, in your professional opinion, how long has American industry been capable of producing steel at this quality level?" Yamamoto looked at the young officer, recognizing in his face the same dawning realization that had gripped the laboratory staff when the full scope of the findings became clear. "Based on the uniformity of samples and the evident maturity of their production processes, I estimate that American industry has been operating at this level for at least 5 to 7 years. This is not new technology being rushed into service. This is established, refined, standard industrial practice." The implication was staggering. While Japanese metallurgists had believed themselves to be competing on roughly equal terms, American industry had been operating from a foundation of structural superiority that predated the conflict itself. Every aircraft, every ship, every tank produced from this steel carried an inherent advantage that no amount of courage or tactical skill could entirely overcome. The admiral asked Yamamoto to continue, and the metallurgist proceeded to explain the strategic implications. American bombers could absorb damage and continue flying because their airframes were constructed from steel that distributed stress more effectively than Japanese materials. American ships could withstand impacts that would penetrate Japanese hulls. American vehicles could operate under conditions that would cause Japanese equipment to fail. But perhaps most devastating was the implication for Japanese offensive capabilities. Weapons constructed from standard Japanese steel, when striking American equipment constructed from this superior material, would be significantly less effective than calculations based on assumed material parity had predicted. Yamamoto concluded his briefing with a detailed comparison of production capacity, Based on the volume and distribution of samples, combined with intelligence estimates of American industrial output, he calculated that American steel mills were producing this quality of material at a rate of approximately 15 million tons per year. Japanese production, even operating at maximum capacity with lower quality standards, could not exceed 2 million tons annually. The admiral sat in silence for several minutes after Yamamoto finished, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke, and his words carried the weight of strategic implications extending far beyond metallurgical science. Dr. Yamamoto, your findings will be classified at the highest level. This information will be shared only with senior command staff, who require it for strategic planning purposes. I want you to prepare a supplementary report focusing on any potential weaknesses or vulnerabilities in American steel that we might exploit. Even a small advantage could prove significant. Over the next 2 months, Yamamoto's team conducted exhaustive analysis searching for any flaw, any weakness, any characteristic of American steel that Japanese forces might turn to their advantage. They tested the material under extreme temperatures, looking for brittleness in cold or softening in heat. They subjected it to corrosive environments, searching for accelerated degradation. They analyzed it for fatigue characteristics, hoping to find evidence that the material weakened more quickly under repeated stress. They found nothing of strategic significance. The steel performed well under all conditions, showing resilience and reliability that matched its impressive strength and ductility. In February of 1944, Yamamoto submitted his supplementary report. It was brief, direct, and offered no comfort to military planners seeking tactical advantages. The conclusion stated simply that American steel represented a systemic industrial advantage that could not be countered through tactical innovation or operational excellence. The only response would be fundamental restructuring of Japanese industrial capacity, a project that would require resources and time that the nation simply did not possess. The report circulated among senior command staff, creating quiet ripples of concern that never manifested in public statements or official policy changes. But those who read Yamamoto's findings and understood their implications began making subtle adjustments to their strategic calculations, privately acknowledging realities that official doctrine could not yet admit. Yamamoto himself continued his work throughout the remainder of the conflict, analyzing samples, testing materials, and documenting the expanding gap between Japanese and American industrial capabilities. With each new fragment that arrived at his laboratory, the pattern reinforced itself. American production not only maintained its quality advantage, but appeared to be accelerating, introducing new alloys and treatments that pushed the boundaries of what Yamamoto had believed possible. In his personal journal, which he kept locked in his desk and shared with no one, Yamamoto recorded observations that went beyond technical analysis. He wrote about the psychology of discovering that fundamental assumptions were wrong, about the cognitive dissonance of maintaining professional objectivity while confronting data that undermined everything he had been taught to believe about Japanese industrial capability. One entry from March of 1944 captured his state of mind with particular clarity. Today we received samples from an American submarine hull. The steel shows properties that our best warship armor cannot match. I find myself wondering how many other assumptions rest on foundations of incomplete information. If we were this wrong about steel, what else have we failed to understand about our opponent's capabilities? The question haunted him through the remaining months of the conflict and into the post-conflict period, when answers began to emerge in full detail. After the conflict ended, Yamamoto had the opportunity to visit American steel production facilities as part of a technical exchange program designed to rebuild Japanese industry. What he saw in Pittsburgh, in Gary, in Birmingham confirmed everything his analysis had suggested and revealed even more that he had not imagined. The American steel mills operated on a scale that dwarfed anything in Japan. Single facilities employed tens of thousands of workers, operated dozens of furnaces simultaneously, and produced in 1 month what an entire year of Japanese production could not match. But more impressive than the scale was the systematic approach to quality control. Every stage of production was monitored, measured, and adjusted to maintain precise specifications. Workers were trained in standardized procedures that eliminated variation. Equipment was maintained on strict schedules that prevented degradation in performance. The industrial culture itself was different. American steelworkers took pride in consistent quality, viewing it as a measure of professional competency. Foremen competed to minimize variation in their sections. Engineers constantly refined processes, seeking incremental improvements that accumulated into substantial advantages over time. Yamamoto toured a facility in Pennsylvania, where the plant manager explained the philosophy behind their quality control systems. The manager was a man named Robert Harrison, a veteran of 30 years in steel production, who had started as a furnace operator and worked his way through every position in the mill. Harrison told him, speaking with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted his industry's capabilities, "Dr. Yamamoto, we learned a long time ago that quality isn't expensive. Poor quality is expensive. Every ton of steel we produce to specification, the first time is a ton we don't have to remelt, reprocess, or scrap. Consistency saves money, saves time, and saves lives when that steel goes into aircraft or ships. We built these systems not because we're better engineers than anyone else, but because we couldn't afford not to." The statement crystallized something that Yamamoto had been struggling to articulate. American industrial superiority was not the result of some inherent national genius or access to secret knowledge. It was the product of systematic investment in processes, equipment, training, and culture over decades. It was the accumulation of thousands of small decisions, each one prioritizing long-term capability over short-term convenience, each one building on the foundation laid by previous generations of workers and engineers. Years later, when Yamamoto had become a senior advisor to Japan's post-conflict industrial reconstruction, he often returned to the lessons learned in that Curie laboratory in November of 1943. The revelation that American steel was 3 times stronger had been shocking not because of the number itself, but because of what it revealed about the depth of the industrial gap that existed. He taught a generation of young Japanese metallurgists and engineers that true industrial strength was not measured in isolated achievements or breakthrough innovations. It was measured in the ability to maintain excellence consistently across millions of tons of production, year after year. It was measured in the systems and processes that ensured every worker understood their role in maintaining quality. It was measured in the willingness to invest in infrastructure and training even when immediate returns were not apparent. The fragment of B-17 fuselage that had started Yamamoto's investigation remained in his possession for the rest of his life. He kept it on his desk, a small piece of metal that had taught him more about industrial capability than a dozen textbooks ever could. When younger colleagues asked about it, he would tell the story of those 3 days in November of 1943, when a microscope revealed a truth that strategic intelligence had missed. He would explain how that small sample had exposed assumptions about industrial parity that proved catastrophically wrong. He would describe the mathematics of the revelation, how 3 times stronger steel meant 3 times less effective weapons, 3 times more resilient aircraft, 3 times wider the gap between assumed capability and actual reality. But he would also emphasize the broader lesson. The steel itself was not the story. The story was about the importance of questioning assumptions, of demanding evidence, of understanding that industrial capability could not be wished into existence through determination or doctrine. It had to be built systematically and patiently, with attention to every detail and every process that contributed to the final product. In his final years, teaching at Tokyo University, Yamamoto would often begin his introductory lectures on materials science with a simple demonstration. He would place 2 pieces of steel on the table in front of his students. One was Japanese steel from 1943. The other was American steel from the same period. He would ask students to examine them visually, to feel their weight, to describe any observable differences. Invariably, students would struggle to identify significant variations. The pieces looked similar, felt similar, seemed similar in every superficial way. Then Yamamoto would show them the microscope images, the stress test results, the compositional analyses. He would watch as realization dawned on their faces, the same realization that had struck him decades earlier. Then he would tell them that the most important skill an engineer could develop was not the ability to solve problems, but the ability to identify which problems actually existed versus which problems were assumed to exist based on incomplete information. He would explain that the Japanese metallurgists of 1943 had been solving the wrong problems because they had not understood the true nature of the challenges they faced. The lesson resonated through generations of students who went on to rebuild Japanese industry into one of the most sophisticated manufacturing economies in the world. Many of them would later say that Yamamoto's first lecture, with its two pieces of steel that looked identical but were fundamentally different, taught them more about engineering practice than any technical course they ever took. The fragment of American steel, that 8 cm by 12 cm piece of B-17 fuselage, became something of a legend in Japanese metallurgical circles. It was the sample that changed understanding, the physical evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. It represented the moment when assumption collided with reality, and reality won decisively. In the end, Yamamoto came to view his discovery not as a failure of Japanese science, but as a success of the scientific method itself. The willingness to test assumptions, to follow evidence wherever it led, to acknowledge when data contradicted belief, these were the principles that ultimately allowed Japan to rebuild its industrial base on firmer foundations. The painful revelation of November 1943 became the foundation for the systematic excellence that characterized Japanese manufacturing in later decades. The story of what Japanese metallurgists said when they discovered American steel was 3 times stronger was ultimately a story about the power of evidence to transform understanding. It was about the courage required to admit when fundamental assumptions were wrong. It was about the long, difficult process of building industrial capability based on systematic excellence rather than hopeful estimation. And it was a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on battlefields, but in laboratories, not with weapons, but with microscopes, not through courage, but through honest assessment of capability and the humble willingness to learn from what the evidence reveals. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.